We're going to continue on with this basic concept of input and utilize Playmaker to build a state machine that does some stuff when certain conditions are met. So we have this user sphere, and the idea is that, based on user input, in this case a spacebar press, causes the sphere to drop. I'm going to move that over, and just to kind of get a little differentiation in here, to kind of reinforce some concepts, I'm going to utilize some basic materials and some basic colors in here. So a little refresher on that process. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've collected a couple of materials that I may or may not use, just something simple. And I have provided those to you. If you go into Blackboard, just above this video, you'll see that there's a resources folder. It's a textures and script example. If you download this folder and unzip it, it will give you a resources folder. Now, I'm going to take a minute and talk about a resources folder. I have one on my desktop here. And a resources folder is not a bad idea to establish for any project. And in this case, I have a resources folder where I'm tracking or prepared to combine some resources of references for color. I have one for images that I'm using for the slides that I'm making, any links that I come across that are useful or valuable. I have a scripts folder here as well. We'll take a look a little bit later at some behind the scenes, what's happening in Playmaker versus scripting and building stuff from the ground up by ourselves. I also have a texture folder in here, which has a series of textures. And then I have this title card folder that I'm kind of making for these videos. So I've provided a resources folder with some of this stuff in there. You'll get the script and the textures and the links. Everything else is up to you to add. But the reason that I want to emphasize this resource folder is that this is something that will travel with any given project. And I recommend you consider working this way and stay organized with all of your assets and resources. And then when we archive this project or we move on from this project, we'll make sure that these are archived together. So if we want to go back in and kind of reference some of our previous material, we can do that. Now, I'll talk to you a little bit about organization a little bit later, but for now, I'm going to import this textures folder. And I want to stress that this textures folder contains a bunch of PNG and maybe some JPEGs, a PSD file as well. And Unity can interpret all of this content and utilize it, everything that's in this folder. So I don't have any concerns about dragging this folder into Unity and trying to use all of it. Now, the easiest way that I'll be able to do this, rather than importing individual assets from Unity, which I could do if I go to Unity and I say assets, import new asset, I could go navigate to my desktop, go find my resources folder, find the textures and select this, and it's going to import into whatever directory I'm looking in here at the assets folder. Now, I'm going to cancel that because I'm going to take a little shortcut. I'm just going to slide Unity over a little bit so I can see the contents of my desktop, or I could just make sure to bring that to the foreground. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the texture folder and just drag and drop that into the root of my assets folder. So wherever I drop it, I get a textures folder. It'll take a moment to process that. But once I go back to Unity, I should have access to the contents of this folder. And again, they're just simple textures that I can utilize here. And these are basic things like some basic color grid. So if I drag and drop this grid onto the ground, I can see that I have this grid showing up. So it'll just kind of give me some differentiation. Now, I may want to utilize some colors, both in combination with these materials or just as kind of standalone. I'll just drag and drop this material and see if I get any better results. I don't, I'm not going to spend too much time with these materials. This is stuff that I just found online for free. But it gives a little bit of dimension to these things, and I can kind of see some basic size and their relationship to each other. It might be that I want to use some colors, just some flat colors. And rather than choosing things arbitrarily, it's not a bad idea to start with some color profiles that you find interesting. And we could do that simply by selecting an image that we find appealing. Or we could look at existing color swatches or utilize some tools that, allow us, that help us put together informed color palettes. Now, I have Pinterest boards dedicated to lots of different projects, and I have a general one dedicated to color, where if I come across something where I like the color profile, I might download that image or just pin it into my profile or into my board. And so in this case, I kind of like some of these blues and yellows and oranges. If I want to utilize some of these colors as reference, in Unity, I could sample these in an image editor of some sort. There's a number of ways that I can get colors in, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this image to the desktop. That gives me a reference of this photo, so I'll close that window. I don't need to look at that anymore. And I'm going to bring this sample in, but I'm not going to drop it in my textures folder because it's not a texture that I want to wrap on an object. This is more of a reference, and it's a reference for color. So I'm going to go to my assets folder. I'm going to right click and create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this color. Maybe color. There we go. And I'm going to go inside my color folder, and I'm just going to click and drag and drop this. And just for kicks, I'm going to go back out to Pinterest, and again, if I wanted to go in here and find, I have a color subboard here and lots of different stuff to where I like, a color or two, or we could go out to a tool like ColorMind.io and kind of look at some existing color templates or popular profiles. Adobe has, let's see, Adobe Color. If we just do a quick search for that, we can go to color.adobe.com and we can look at, explore popular color profiles or trends. And if we find something that we want to utilize, let me go back to Explore here for a moment. For some reason I ended up in these blues, but let's assume that this is a color, something that I wanted to keep. I can either just drag this swatch to the desktop. It doesn't seem to want to be capturing it, so I'll take a screenshot of it. Or I'll download this as a JPEG. It looks like I can do that directly from here now. Or I could take a screenshot of it. And so just any way to get a sample of this and then store it in your game project. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new material based on one of these colors. Now, I could make a separate materials folder, but I'm going to keep my materials that are based on just simple flat colors for now in my color folder. So I'm going to right click, choose to create, and I'm going to create a material. This new material, I'm going to call this, I'll call it orange. Very creative name that I came up with there. And so with that color swatch selected, I'll just come over here and I'm looking at the orange material. I have all these parameters that I can change. And what I want to do is find the albedo and click on this white swatch, which brings up the color picker. Now, this color picker, I don't have to actually sample. This image doesn't have to be inside Unity to sample it. In fact, if I click on this eyedropper here, so let's see, what are we saying here? Yeah, sure. We'll allow this to record some preferences or choose things outside of the application. Let me try this again. So let's go back here. I'm going to click on this color swap, this eyedropper here, and you can see that as I roll around, anything on the screen becomes an active color. Doesn't look like it wants to pick up on the system dock here. Seems like it doesn't want to get over here either, but fortunately, I do have a sample over here. Now, I think what that warning was is that can I access this color picker information outside of the Unity interface? Looks like it lets me do the, and I just said, okay, I'll do that later. So that's probably what that warning was, that I didn't didn't spend any time reading. So I will click on this orange. Let's see, let's get back in here. I'm going to go find that orange and click on it. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit of a conflict here with that color picker strategy that I was demonstrating. I think it has to do with my screen recording software. I'll demo this one more time and just tell you kind of what to look for. So what I was demonstrating was that if we click on the color swatch, we get the color picker. And at that point, we can click on this little eyedropper, and I can go sample from around, kind of from around the image. Now, that time it keeps coming up green for some reason, and I'm not quite sure why that is. So it looks like this color picker inside the color window is not necessarily translating the way that I want it to. Maybe you're encountering the same thing, but I think it has to do with something that my screencast software. But there's another little eyedropper over here on the right side. If I click on that, you can see that as we roll around, it's sampling. It's doing the same thing basically. And if I roll over that orange and click on it, it does highlight that orange, loads that as the color. Now, if I click on this swatch, I go back into this color picker, and I really wanted to stay in here for a moment and utilize this eyedropper. So I'm not sure if it's user error on my part. It wouldn't be the first time. But in the past, I've always expected to select this eyedropper and just kind of look around, and even on the desktop. And so now my desktop is actively searching. So there's definitely a little bug going on. It shows the green again for some reason. So, but I'm just going to go back to this orange. This color picker can be very valuable once we start establishing colors that we want to use, because down here at the bottom, we have some basic swatches. And if I just, whatever color I have selected, I'll just click on the swatch, and now I have that color here. So I'm going to try to sample the blue again using this technique I just mentioned by clicking on that eyedropper. I'm going to roll over, and I'm just watching up here in the color swatch. So it's not as precise, but kind of got the color that I wanted here. I'll pop open the color picker, and I'm just going to build a new swatch about that based on that. So I got these two colors. I got one material it's referencing, and I'm going to go back to the orange. Just a real quick tweak. I'm going to take the smoothness of this down, and I'm going to take this color and just drop it on the sphere. So that was a roundabout way to kind of just reinforce the decision to make some decent color choices. We don't need to spend a lot of time doing this. We can always go back and revisit this, but we kind of want to spend, just think about the visual design of things as we go. So when we last left our little sphere hero here, it was, we have a state machine assigned to it. This used gravity. Can be redundant potentially depending on how we have the initial state of our object being set. So if we said by default our sphere is not using gravity, we would not need to use this action. I can delete this action, or I can say, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe there's an advantage of me having the ability to set this object's gravity to off on the fly. And I might want to use that later. I might just uncheck this action. We still have the action, we still have the logic, it's just not being used, it's not being listened to. And I can hit this little triangle to collapse that. So now the only thing that's being listened to on the idle state is we're listening for this keyboard input. And then we transition to this drop object. Now I'm going to take my user sphere and Command D to duplicate it. I'm going to move this over, and I'm going to call this engine sphere or game engine sphere. And the idea here is that this object, we want to have something happen based on the engine's input, and then we'll kind of combine these things together. So in other words, in the first, in the user object, we're waiting for user input. So if we're waiting for the space. In this engine object, we're going to wait for like a collision to happen. So you might have noticed, and I want to point out, that when I duplicated my user sphere and renamed it, it came with its own logic. So this will transfer with game objects, this logic. So when you build logic on an object, if you make an enemy that has certain behaviors, you can just duplicate it and it'll carry over the logic and be kind of an independent object. So right now we have two objects that are listening for the spacebar. And before I remove this state machine, we'll watch and see what happens. I hit the spacebar and they both fall. Now, if I wanted to differentiate between the two, I could select the object. I'll add quite a bit of drag to the second object. Do like 0.5. I'm not sure how it's going to translate, but now the object on the left should fall and hit the ground faster. Just a little bit faster, so I guess it wasn't as dramatic as I thought it would be. I'll bump up the drag a bit more. Hit play again. And again, so you can see that you can have two completely independent objects. But I'm going to take that drag back down. With this engine sphere selected, I'm going to get rid of this entire state machine. There's a couple different ways that we can do this. If you've noticed that as we click around on these different game objects, we can look at the parameters and the components that have been attached to this object. And whenever we add an FSM to an object, we get this Playmaker FSM component. We can always remove components of a game object by clicking on the little ellipsis here and saying remove component. I'm going to deselect that because I can also do this a different way. The way I prefer to do this is if we select the object that we want to remove the state machine from, this state machine I want to get rid of, I'm just going to right click in this gray workspace and choose to remove the FSM component. That eliminates any state machine that's been assigned to it. You can see that it eliminates the little icon that was listed here, and we're just going to select our engine sphere again. I'm going to right click, add a new FSM. And this time around, we want the sphere to drop. So I'm going to make sure that use gravity is on. And I'll just leave it right where it's at, actually. So when I hit the play button, this sphere should fall to the ground, unlike the one with the spacebar, right? I'll toggle the play button. I'm going to go back into the first state of our state machine, and I'm going to call this idle. And this is a common state name that I'll use when we're waiting for some kind of input. So in other words, the logic's kind of wound up. We're waiting to either hit something or be launched as a projectile, or we're waiting for the player to stand on us or spring a trap or whatever. In a lot of cases, we're just waiting for something to happen. And I like to use this idle state. Now, this object that's falling, to get some game object input, we're not causing this object to fall. It's falling based on the gravity simulation. We're not causing the object to collide with the ground. However, that is some game engine input that we can listen for. So with this engine sphere selected, I'm going to scroll down and listen for a physics category. Inside the physics category, I want to listen for some kind of a collision. Because this object has a rigid body on it, we can utilize all these physics actions. And one of the things that happens with physics-based objects, even if we're not listening for them, is that they generate collision events or collision flags when objects run into each other in Unity. So when you made your Gravity Lab project and all these objects are bouncing around, every time an object gets hit by something or hits the ground or falls over, it generates a collision event. So what we're going to do is with our first state, our idle state selected, I'm going to double click on collision event. And we're going to build a very simple scenario that causes something to happen to the sphere when it hits the ground. The game object that we're talking to is the owner. That's a good thing. We have the collision event that we're listening for. We have on collision enter, which is what we want, but there are some other collision types that we can listen for. But we're just going to listen to on collision enter. We're going to leave the tag blank. We'll talk about collision tags later, but just like our spacebar event, our spacebar actions, we want to create a send event that transitions from the idle state when this collision happens. So I'm going to go to this send event. I'm going to choose the drop-down menu, and I'm going to create a new event. And this event, I'm going to say either has hit something or hit the ground or whatever we want to call it. I'm going to call mine hit something. I'm going to hit return. We get this red error. We can fix that by clicking on it, but I like to right-click on the state and add a transition, hit something. So we now have, I'll just deselect so you can see it. That's a gray, light gray. So we have an idle state. This action is waiting for a collision to enter. So the owner object is waiting to hit something. And if it does, it's going to follow the transition for hit something. It doesn't go anywhere yet. So what I need to do is right click and add a state and then click and drag this wire over to it. Now I'll share with you a little bit of workflow. Rather than right clicking, adding a state, clicking and dragging and attaching that, which I can do, I'm just going to undo. On a PC, I can hold down the control key, and on the Mac, I can hold down the command key. And if I left click and drag, because I'm holding down my command key on a Mac or control on a PC, when I release my mouse, at the end of this transition, we end up with a transition state. Just a little workflow thing. If you hold down control and drag out a transition, you'll result in a state at the end. So that, as we're building more complex state machines, that may be helpful. So if we end up in this state, I'm going to say I've hit the ground. I've hit ground. So in other words, the object that owns this, notice I left out the punctuation just because I don't want that to do anything goofy. I don't know if an apostrophe would cause any kind of glitch behind the scene, but we are dealing with some pretty particular coding here. So this is testable. It doesn't do anything when we hit the ground, but we'll stay in the idle state until we hit the ground. And when we hit the ground, we should transition to this new state. So let me test this. I'm going to hit the play button, and I'm just watching the idle state. And then as soon as I hit the ground, you can see that it transitions over to this hit state. This is something that we're going to use. I'll just lift this up. I'm going to add a little bit of drag to it. And this is really just for the sake of the video demonstration so we can see this a little bit more clearly when we're debugging. So I have the engine sphere selected. Therefore, I'm focusing on this state machine to test. I'm going to hit the play button. Because I've lifted this object up and because it has some drag, it takes a little while to fall. That way I know that it's not transitioning until it's supposed to. And then of course I can hit the space bar and then cause the other one to fall. I'm going to go back and modify the spacebar logic here just a moment to include some of the stuff that we just included here. I'm going to go back to the user sphere and I'm going to make this logic just slightly more complex. The logic here is that we are we're starting on the idle state. We move over to the drop object based on our key press. What we could do here, as we turn on gravity, we're also going to listen for a collision event just like we did. We're going to listen for a collision with the owner. If we get the collision, I'm going to create a new event. And this time I'm just going to simply shorthand this and call it next, just for the sake of the demo. And I'll create a new state. So we have idle. We're stuck here until we hit the space bar. We're stuck here until our object hits the ground. And on this state, maybe we'll wait for a second. So we'll call this wait. And then we'll transition to something else. But let's test the logic here. I'm going to hit the play button. We are stuck in the idle state as planned. I just clicked on the left clicked on the gameplay window to make sure it has focus. I'm going to tap the space bar. We're in the dropped object state until we hit the ground, where we ended up on the wait state. And I'm going to toggle the play button here. And I'm just going to look for, there's a wait action. I know it happens to be under time. I'll look for wait. And I'm going to do something kind of tricky here. I'm going to wait for 1 second. It's going to be real time. But the finished event, I've already created a next finished event. And I'm just going to borrow that same next event because it's on a different state. And so it won't, this is kind of very linear. So I can use this next state, just a simple state transition out of that state. I'm using this next transition. I'm going to right click and add one more state and just kind of wire that down here. You'll notice that I can move these states around too to reorganize them. But the flow right now for this state is idle. Press the space bar, we end up dropping the object. When we hit the ground, we end up in this wait state for however long we declare it. And then we'll just destroy the game object. So I'm going to call this destroy. And on this state, if we go into the game object category, alphabetical order, there we go. We can see that there's several different kinds of destroy. We can destroy an object. We can destroy multiple objects, but destroy self is going to be the easiest thing because we don't need to target an object. Remember, this is the owner of this logic now is the user sphere. And so if we say destroy self, that just means destroy the object that we're talking to. So this logic should hold up. If I didn't make any mistakes, I should be able to hit the play button. And our sphere is floating here in space until we hit the space bar. It drops, it goes to the wait state, and then it completely destroys itself. It's no longer in the hierarchy. You can see even that the logic disappears in the Playmaker window. So this is the difference between user input and game engine input. We ended up combining those two. The first half of this, in fact, if I just kind of highlight these, I can color code them if I want to. Set those to blue. I'm going to click and drag and highlight those. There's a little color swatch here on the right side of the state. And I'll set these to yellow. Everything that is yellow is game engine input. So this is, well, technically the game engine input here happens at the dropped object. This is where the collision event happens. But if we end up in the yellow states, it's because we got some game engine feedback. If we end up in the drop object state, it's because we have the get key down. We got some user input. So that's just kind of a really kind of high level breakdown of user input versus game engine input. We'll start to look at this through a little bit more logic by creating a game where we create like a little breakout scenario, maybe a little Pong scenario. We'll utilize some of the things that we've learned in our Gong project, or excuse me, our Gravity Lab project to make this new game. But we'll get started in the next set of presentations, kind of roughing out our game. We'll talk about the required mechanics. So make sure that you get the basics of Playmaker down before we jump into production, and we'll do that in the next presentation.